So what is it that makes aperture priority mode more useful than any of the other exposure modes for taking pictures of landscapes? Aperture priority mode gets its name because it allows you to decide which aperture number you want to use to take a photograph, while the camera automatically sets the corresponding shutter speed, based on light levels, to achieve the correct exposure. In other words, it lets you prioritize the aperture selection, and it chooses the shutter speed accordingly. As the lens aperture is the most influential factor over depth of field, the zone of focus in a photograph, aperture priority mode is the most practical shooting mode if you are photographing a subject or situation in which control over depth of field is important. Landscape photography is the best example. Generally, when shooting landscapes, you'll want to make sure your depth of field is broad enough to record the whole scene in focus, from the immediate foreground to infinity, which means that you'll need to set a small aperture, such as f(11). Aperture priority mode lets you do this easily, because you have to actively set the required aperture. When shooting portraits, the opposite tends to apply. You want shallow depth of field so that your subject is recorded in focus but the background is thrown out of focus. That means making sure you take the picture with a wide aperture such as f4 or f2.8, which again is easy when shooting in aperture priority mode because it's you and not the camera that decides which aperture to use. That said, you can still control which aperture is set using other exposure modes, but it just requires a slightly different and longer way of working. In shutter priority T/V mode, for example, you need to change the shutter speed until the camera sets the aperture you want. In program mode, you can use the program shift function to change the aperture and shutter combination that the camera has set until you get the right aperture. Where aperture priority mode trumps other modes is that once you've set an aperture, the camera won't change it, even if light levels fluctuate. Instead, the shutter speed adjusts to maintain the correct exposure. This wouldn't be the case if you set shutter priority. If light levels change, your camera gives shutter speed priority, automatically adjusting the aperture to maintain correct exposure, and so your control over depth of field is diminished. Similarly, in program mode, the camera would change the aperture-shutter speed combination in response to changing light. Aperture priority mode is also handy for general use, when you're wandering, shooting anything that takes your fancy, such as architecture, details, abstracts or candids. Depth of field requirements will vary depending on the shot. 1 minute you need lots, the next as little as possible, but you can alter it quickly with the flick of the camera's input dial, and the viewfinder display will keep you informed of exactly which aperture and corresponding shutter speed using.